There's a house in Memphis that looks ordinary to anyone passing by, until you learn who took his final breath inside it. Bobby Blue Bland, the man whose voice was equal parts velvet and fire, the man who shaped modern blues while the world was still catching up, spent his last days behind those quiet walls. And the stories he left behind there are nothing like what fans think they know. In one of his final interviews, he spoke about his first hit, his legacy, and the years he spent chauffeuring B.B. King, but he also revealed the weight he carried and the truth about the illness that slowly took him away at 83. Today, we're stepping into the place where his journey ended, and uncovering what really happened to one of the last kings of the blues. Let's delve in. Bobby Blue Bland entered the world as Robert Calvin Brooks in the little town of Barrettville, Tennessee. His father, I.J. Brooks, walked out soon after he was born, leaving Robert to grow up without him. When his mother remarried, Robert took the last name of his stepfather, Leroy Bridgeforth, a man everyone simply called Leroy Bland, and that name would stay with him for the rest of his life. School never had a chance to shape him. He left in the 3rd grade, trading classrooms for long days in the cotton fields, and he never returned to finish his education. In 1947, he and his mother moved to Memphis, where he started singing with neighborhood gospel groups like the Miniatures. But it was Beale Street that truly pulled him in, night after night. He wandered the clubs and corners of the city's most electric stretch, falling in with a tight circle of young musicians: B.B. King, Roscoe Gordon, Junior Parker, and Johnny Ace, a group that would later be known as the Beale Streeters. In 1951, a young Bobby Bland caught the attention of talent scout Ike Turner, who brought him to Tough Green's house in Memphis to record for Modern Records. Because Bland couldn't read, they started with the only song he fully knew by heart. They call it Stormy Monday. That early version was never released, but a decade later he would record it again, and it would become one of his most enduring hits. Turner played piano on Bland's first 2 records, released under the name Robert Bland, but none of his early singles for Modern or Sun in 1951 to 1952 gained traction. Still, the recordings were strong enough to grab the interest of Duke Records. Those early sessions show Bland searching for his own sound, but his momentum was interrupted when he was drafted into the U.S. Army. For 2 years he served, even joining a military band that performed with singer Eddie Fisher. When he returned to Memphis in 1954, things had changed. Old friends like Johnny Ace were rising fast, and Bland slipped into Ace's review before heading back to Duke Records, now under the control of Houston businessman Don Roby. According to biographer Charles Farley, Roby handed Bland a contract he couldn't read and guided his hand to sign it. A contract that paid him only half a cent per record, a fraction of the standard rate Bland released his first Duke single in 1955. By 1956, he was touring the Chitlin circuit with Junior Parker in a revue called Blues Consolidated, even acting as Parker's valet and driver at first. Soon he was back in the studio, working with band leader Bill Harvey and arranger Joe Scott. Together they shaped the sweeping horn-driven blues sound that became Bobby Blue Bland's signature, often with guitarist Wayne Bennett adding the final touch. Unlike many of his peers, Bland never played an instrument. His voice was the only tool he needed. His earliest memory of Bobby Blue Bland came from a black-and-white television set sometime around 1965. Bland appeared on The Lloyd Thaxton Show, the LA-based dance program that mirrored American Bandstand, but with a far more adventurous taste in music. On Thaxton's stage, Sonny and Cher and the Byrds shared space with James Brown, Solomon Burke, Les McCann, and, on that particular day, Bobby Bland. For many fans, the first glimpse of Bobby Blue Bland arrived through a flickering black-and-white television screen in the mid-1960s. He appeared on The Lloyd Thaxton Show, the Los Angeles dance program that blended teenage energy with unexpectedly bold musical choices. On that same stage where Sonny and Cher and the Byrds performed, Thaxton also welcomed James Brown, Solomon Burke, Les McCann, and on one memorable afternoon, Bobby Bland. The viewer who watched him that day couldn't recall the exact song, only the impression it left. A voice smoother, more refined, and more adult than anything he was used to. For a young listener raised on rougher, grittier soul, Bland's sophistication was almost too polished, and the memory faded into the background. Everything changed 3 years later. One evening, while listening to WUFO, the soul powerhouse broadcasting out of Amherst, New York, he heard a swell of horns followed by a voice so silky that even B.B. King would later describe it as satin. The song was "Save Your Love for Me." It floated above the familiar rotation of Wilson Pickett, Otis Redding, and Sam and Dave. This time, Bland had his full attention. The precision of the diction, the emotional restraint, the way the lyrics were shaped line by line, it all lingered long after the song ended. I wish I knew why I'm so in love with you. Nancy Wilson had recorded it first, and other singers had taken their turn with it, but something in Bland's interpretation felt definitive. The listener who had once dismissed him now found himself placing Bobby Bland alongside the greats, even beside Sam Cooke, whom he believed no one could touch. Suddenly, Blue seemed less like a nickname and more like a destiny. What he didn't realize then was just how much work had gone into creating that unmistakable sound. Bland had spent years sharpening his phrasing, experimenting with breath, tone, and nuance until he arrived at a voice that no one else could replicate. The effort paid off. In the 1960s, Bobby "Blue" Bland quietly became one of the decade's most successful R&B artists, scoring the 4th highest number of charting singles. 3 of those rose to number 1, I Pity the Fool. In 1961, That's the Way Love Is backed with Call on Me in 1963, and his biggest crossover triumph, Ain't Nothing You Can Do, in 1964. Part of the reason many casual listeners didn't grasp his influence at the time was visibility. Unlike the artists signed to Motown or Stax, Bland wasn't pushed into the mainstream. His label aimed instead at a mature, predominantly female African-American audience, a demographic often ignored by major labels, but one that embraced Bland wholeheartedly. He didn't need the flash of pop stardom. His music found the people who understood him, and that loyalty sustained him for decades. Through discipline, elegance, and emotional truth, Bobby "Blue" Bland became one of the most distinctive voices in American music. A quiet giant whose influence only grew as generations caught up to what he had been doing all along. The musical direction Bobby "Blue" Bland eventually embraced wasn't a clever marketing invention. It was who he truly was. His warm baritone, refined phrasing, and sensual, understated delivery naturally set him apart from the hard-edged blues dominating the era. Bland himself admitted he never cared much for the rougher style of his peers. Instead, he leaned into quiet pleading, humility, and a vulnerable softness that resonated deeply, especially with women. He once described his artistic experiment this way: I kept wondering what would happen if I took the growl out of the blues and replaced it with some kind of mellow moan. Would people still like it or call me a traitor to the blues? It didn't take long to learn that the women sure enough liked it. And brother, that's all I needed to know. Long before he was called the Black Frank Sinatra, Bobby Bland was just a boy in Rosemark, Tennessee, a rural town of 500 people outside Memphis. Music found him early. Encouraged by Mutt Piggy, a local musician and blues singer, young Bobby began singing on street corners for nickels and dimes. Ironically, the songs he belted out weren't blues at all, but hillbilly tunes he picked up from listening to the Grand Ole Opry. Anything was better than cotton fields and classrooms. He never got past the 3rd grade and went through life unable to read or write, relying almost entirely on his ear and instinct. Bobby and his mother formed a tight bond after his biological father abandoned them. When she remarried, he took the last name of his stepfather, becoming Bobby Bland, the name that would someday headline marquees. but his mother saw more for him than fieldwork and small-town limits. In her mind, staying in Rosemark meant a lifetime of picking cotton. So when Bobby was 17, she made a life-altering decision. They packed up and moved to Memphis. Her reasoning was simple but profound. Memphis, then considered the heartbeat of the Mississippi Delta and often called the Main Street of Negro America, offered opportunity, possibility, and a pathway for a boy whose only love was singing. In Memphis, Bobby Blue Bland scraped together a living any way he could. He washed dishes and mopped floors in his mother's small restaurant, delivered groceries on a battered second-hand bicycle, and spent time at a neighborhood garage learning the mechanics of cars. But the real turning point came when he learned to drive. Earning a driver's license gave him a kind of freedom he had never known, and immediately opened doors. Suddenly he was parking cars at the Peabody Hotel, ferrying laborers from downtown Memphis to cotton fields in Mississippi and Arkansas, and even chauffeuring customers to local bootleggers for extra cash. Driving would become a skill that served him far beyond those early hustles. Even while working whatever jobs kept the lights on, singing remained the center of Bland's world. He attended the Baptist church with his mother and sang in the choir, and on weekends he joined the Miniatures, a 5-man gospel group patterned after the Pilgrim Travelers, the same Houston-based collective that once featured a young Lou Rawls Bland devoured gospel music. The Mighty Clouds of Joy, the Highway QCs, the Soul Stirrers, and his personal favorite, Ira Tucker and the Dixie Hummingbirds. Yet as he grew bolder, he also gravitated toward the nighttime allure of Beale Street. Unlike many of the young men drawn to the rough blues pouring out of Beale Street's bars and Handy Park, where hopeful musicians like B.B. King tried to get noticed, Bland found himself pulled toward a different sound. He felt at home among the more refined, jazz-influenced artists who played smooth, urbane blues rather than the grittier style he never cared for. His musical heroes were men like Amos Milburn, Charles Brown, Lowell Fulson, T-Bone Walker, Louis Jordan, Jimmy Witherspoon, and Nat King Cole. Their elegance shaped him. It was also on Beale Street that Bland fell in with a loose-knit circle of musicians who called themselves the Beale Streeters. The group was fluid, a rotating cast that supported one another's performances. At various times it included B.B. King, Johnny Ace, Roscoe Gordon, Earl Forrest, and saxophonist Adolph Duncan. This was where Bland's lifelong friendship with B.B. King began. King was 5 years older, already gaining local fame, and Bland admired him deeply. He admitted later, "I idolized him, and still do." Stories have often painted Bland as King's valet, but B.B. himself dismissed that as myth. What really happened was simpler and more meaningful. Bland offered to help King in any way he could, driving, carrying equipment, or whatever needed doing, because he wanted to learn. As Bland put it, he let me hang around and get some kind of experience. Bobby Blue Bland often spoke with disarming honesty about his early years on Beale Street. He admitted that at first he was little more than an eager outsider hovering on the edge of the Beale Streeters. He kept singing, but he knew he was rough, his timing was uneven, and he hadn't yet found a style that belonged to him. In those days, he leaned heavily on a falsetto he borrowed from his hero, B.B. King, trying to imitate rather than innovate. Still, Bland pushed forward. One of his boldest moves was stepping onto the stage at amateur night at the Palace Theater, hosted by WDIA disc jockey Rufus Thomas. The Palace crowd was notoriously brutal, the Memphis equivalent of the Apollo. The stage was shared by singers, acrobats, jugglers, comedians, and every kind of performer imaginable, all facing an audience ready to pelt them with tomatoes or anything else they could throw. To make matters worse, a character known as the Lord High Executioner would burst out from the wings and fire blank shots at contestants who failed to impress winners, were chosen by applause, and rewarded with exactly $1. Bland, like everyone else, wasn't there for the money. He was hoping someone in the crowd would see potential. He won several times, enough to catch the attention he'd been hoping for. Those victories led to his first recording sessions in 1950 and 1951 for small labels like Chess, Modern, and Duke. The sessions themselves were usually squeezed in at the tail end of someone else's studio time, and the results went nowhere commercially. But one person took notice: David J. Mattis, owner of Duke Records, who signed the 21-year-old Bland to his first recording contract in 1951. Just as opportunity finally seemed within reach, Bland's progress stalled. He was drafted into the U.S. Army, forced to put his dreams on hold while he served. Even so, he found his way back to music. By the end of his service, he had joined Special Services, an integrated entertainment unit created to lift troop morale. There, he performed songs by Nat King Cole and Charles Brown, singers whose smooth sophistication mirrored the direction he would later take. Bland never stopped studying the artists around him or the hits spinning on jukeboxes. During his military years, he gravitated toward the gentler, more polished style of Tony Bennett, Billy Eckstine, and Perry Como. Their softness, their control, and their emotional clarity would quietly seep into his voice. By the time he returned home, Bobby Bland wasn't just copying influences. He was on the verge of discovering his own unmistakable sound. When Bobby "Blue" Bland returned from military service in 1955, he stepped straight back into the world he loved: the stage, the clubs, and the long, demanding nights of performance. His first major opportunity came through Junior Parker, an already established star who was leading his own band, the Blue Flames. Bland joined Parker not as an equal but in a clear supporting role. He drove the car, set up the equipment, handled whatever chores were needed, and opened the shows. Their review, billed as Blues Consolidated, began touring the Chitlin circuit in 1956. The network of black-run venues across the South, where black artists could safely perform for black audiences. Bland remained with Parker until 1961, eventually stepping out on his own with the Blue Flames backing him. Like Bland, Parker recorded for Duke Records, and both men had to deal with the label's intimidating new boss, Donald Diedrich Robey. Robey had entered into partnership with Duke founder David Mattis in 1952, but he quickly made it clear that he wanted full control. By 1953, he had it. And according to a story repeated for decades, Robey made his intentions unmistakably clear during buyout negotiations by placing a pistol on the table in front of Mattis. It was his way of saying there would be no debate. As the new sole owner of Duke, Robey rewrote the contracts. He knew Bobby Bland couldn't read or write, and he guided Bland's hand as he signed a deal that paid him half a cent per record. Far below the industry's 2-cent standard, Robey also had a habit of acquiring songs through questionable means and claiming the writing credits himself under the pseudonym Dedrick Malone, securing all publishing royalties. Yet when Bland was asked later about Robey's heavy-handed business tactics, he remained loyal. "Well, he's in business," he said. "Each company that you get with does the same thing, but Robey did a lot of people a lot of favors, like me for one, getting a chance to record." Part of this loyalty came from Bland's nature. He was shy, insecure, and in many ways needed the structure Robey provided. Robey, for all his flaws, played a paternal role in Bland's life, and Bland, who had spent much of his childhood without a father, responded to that, even at the cost of fair compensation. What cannot be denied is that Robey recognized Bland's potential. No matter how the songs were obtained, he had an unmistakable instinct for material that suited Bland's voice. The 2 decades Bland spent at Duke Records produced the greatest music of his career. His recordings from this era generated a long list of R&B hits, many of which became enduring blues and soul standards. Remarkably, more than 2/3 of those hits crossed over onto the pop charts, a rare accomplishment for a blues artist. Bobby "Blue" Bland's breakthrough arrived in 1957 with his first major hit, "Farther On Up the Road." The single opened the door to a long, extraordinary stretch of music that produced some of the most enduring songs in modern blues and soul. Over the next decade, Bland released classics like It's My Life, Baby, I Smell Trouble, Little Boy Blue, Cry, 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 Don't Cry No More, Ain't That Lovin' You, Stormy Monday, and the explosive Turn On Your Love Light. These singles were accompanied by a run of remarkable albums: Two Steps from the Blues, 1961, Here's the Man, 1962, Call on Me, 1963, The Soul of the Man, 1966, and Touch of the Blues, 1967. Fans and critics alike still rank these albums among the finest recordings in blues history, and nearly every LP he cut for Duke Records contains material of lasting merit. Around 1957, Bland's vocal identity began to crystallize. After abandoning the falsetto he once borrowed from B.B. King, he searched for something uniquely his own, and found it in a gritty, emotional device he called the squall. Bland later acknowledged that he lifted the idea from gospel preacher Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father, specifically from the sermon, The Eagle Stirreth His Nest. But the squall was only one piece of the puzzle. What truly shaped Bobby's voice and sound was the partnership with arranger and bandleader Joe Scott. No one had a greater influence on Bobby Bland than Joe Scott. Bland himself said, "He was everything. Without Scott, I wouldn't be the singer I am." From 1958 through 1968, Scott controlled every detail of Bland's musical presentation: the band, the arrangements, the recording sessions, and even Bland's approach to phrasing and diction. Scott envisioned a sound that fused traditional blues guitar with bold, brassy horn arrangements inspired by the big bands of the 1940s, Louis Jordan, Lionel Hampton, Count Basie. He took those jazz-inflected textures and blended them seamlessly with the soul revue style emerging in the 1960s, giving Bland a sound that was both contemporary and deeply rooted. Scott also spent countless hours coaching Bobby on technique: how to deliver a lyric, how to shape a phrase, how to use a microphone with precision. Bland absorbed everything. Known for his perfectionism, he would work a song for hours, breaking it down, memorizing its emotional contours, and mastering every detail before he dared to perform or record it. To preserve the earthy foundation of the blues, Scott always anchored Bland's arrangements with a blistering lead guitarist. Pat Hare, Clarence Holloman, and most famously Wayne Bennett contributed unforgettable lines, especially Bennett's elegant guitar work on Bland's version of T-Bone Walker's Stormy Monday, now regarded as definitive. Although Joe Scott and Bobby Bland gradually went their separate ways after 1969, the decade they spent together had already shaped Bland permanently. The lessons Scott instilled, discipline, detail, emotional control, and musical daring, stayed with him for the rest of his life. Bobby Blue Bland built his fame the hard way, not only through critically acclaimed recordings, but through relentless touring that brought his music directly to the people who loved him. At his peak, he performed more than 300 one-night shows a year, crisscrossing the country in a grueling schedule few artists could endure. And despite rising to national prominence, he never abandoned his roots. Bland continued to play juke joints, cafes, county fairs, and intimate blues clubs across the South, maintaining a deep bond with the African-American audiences who had supported him from the beginning. In 1973, Duke Records was sold to MCA, marking the end of an era. Some critics rushed to declare that Bland's best work was behind him, but his story was far from finished. Although the Duke years set an extraordinarily high bar, he continued evolving over the next 3 decades, building new chapters in his career rather than living in the shadow of the old ones. The MCA years drew mixed reactions. Much of the criticism centered on geography and stylistic perception. Bland was now recording in Los Angeles, a world away from the southern landscapes that had shaped his early music, and some felt the polished West Coast sound clashed with the Bobby Bland mystique. The studio bands were seasoned L.A. session players, and producers Steve Barry and Michael O'Martian came from pop backgrounds, which raised concerns that the music was drifting too far from blues and R&B. Yet Bland's audience stayed with him, and several MCA releases proved the skeptics wrong. His California album featured the R&B top 10 hit This Time I'm Gone for Good, and its follow-up, Dreamer, produced I Wouldn't Treat a Dog, which reached the R&B top 5. MCA's wider distribution also introduced Bland to new listeners outside his long-established black fan base. He reunited with B.B. King during this period, recording 2 acclaimed albums with his old friend, the studio project Together for the First Time, and a live album from their Coconut Grove performance in Los Angeles. Bland's final home was Malaco Records in Jackson, Mississippi, where he signed in 1985 and stayed for 18 years. Unlike MCA, Malaco focused directly on the black Southern audience that had embraced him from the start. The label offered him creative freedom, stability, and a sense of belonging that reminded him of his earliest days at Duke. Malaco had a family atmosphere like Duke used to have, he said, grateful for the environment that supported both his artistry and his spirit. He rewarded the label's faith with some of the finest late-career work of any blues vocalist. Bland recorded a dozen albums with Malaco and earned 7 Grammy nominations for his releases there. One standout was Midnight Run, 1990, which stayed on the R&B charts for more than 18 months, a testament to Bland's enduring power as a storyteller and vocalist. In his later years, Bobby Blue Bland lived a quiet, deeply personal life in his Germantown home, a peaceful suburb just outside Memphis. The house itself was modest, not the kind of mansion people might expect from a man often called the Black Frank Sinatra. It was a single-story residence with soft lighting, warm earth-tone walls, and family photographs carefully placed throughout, reminders of the people he loved and the decades he spent on the road. Nothing in the house was flashy. Bland preferred comfort over extravagance. A well-worn recliner positioned perfectly in front of his favorite records, a tidy kitchen where he liked simple meals, and a bedroom kept immaculately neat, illuminated by morning light through wide windows. His lifestyle during these years was equally understated. He rose early, listened to gospel or Nat King Cole, and often sat on the screened back porch overlooking his quiet yard. Visitors said he carried himself with the same elegance he had on stage, but with a gentler, slower rhythm. He rarely traveled except for select performances, choosing instead to enjoy family, rest, and routine. Bobby Blue Bland died of congestive heart failure on June 23, 2013, in Germantown, Tennessee. He was 83. Even at the height of his fame, Bland carried a humility rarely found among legends. Near the end of his life, he summed up his hopes for how the world might remember him. "I'd like to be remembered as just a good old country boy that did his best to give 'em something to listen to help them through a lot of sad moments, happy moments, whatever." It was a simple wish from a man whose voice had carried generations through all of those moments and more.